What we have here today is the i7-3770. Once a pretty high-end chip and a pretty good gaming CPU, now it's getting pretty old and showing its age. Released in April of 2012, so actually before the previous one I did of the FX video, this is a classic Intel chip with 4 cores and 8 threads and 8 megabytes of L3 cache. This is 14 years old now, so don't expect too much from it. The cheapest way to get these is in some old Dell workstation computers, and that's exactly what I have here today. So no overclocking, this is just stock, and this isn't the 3770K anyway, this is just the stock default version of this chip. In this Dell machine, it ran at 3.7 gigahertz most of the time during games and during benchmarking, which is its all-core turbo boost clock anyway. In this Dell, according to MSI Afterburner, it was pulling about 50 watts of power. Now that could be wrong, but its TDP is 75 watts anyway, so it's not too far off. What I have is not the most ideal situation, but it's what I have. I have 24 gigabytes of DDR3 at 1600 megahertz. Worked perfectly with no issues. Honestly, almost no games used more than 16 gigabytes anyway, so no big deal. If we just look at just pure CPU performance before we get into games, in Cinebench R15, I got a multi-core score of 663 and a single core score of 140. If you look at the multiplier, that's 4.75 times the single core, as compared to the FX chip, which is 6.67. So while AMD may have been fibbing a little bit about the 8-core processor, it does show up in the results that it has better scaling with cores. In fact, the FX chip was a little bit faster in multi-core, but really slow compared to single core. The i7 had 6% slower for multi-core, but 33% better for single core. And that single core is what's going to help us today. But with the multi-core being not very good, even compared to the FX chip, there also isn't necessarily a huge difference between these CPUs. But that's fair, they're about the same age anyway, and they were kind of competitive with each other. I think the FX chip ended up being a little bit cheaper overall, but the i7 was much more efficient and it was better for the games at the time. If we step right into the benchmarks, I'm doing most of these at 1080p medium and then some games at 1080p low. But in Battlefront 2, I got an average of 140 and a 1% low of 70 FPS. That's 37% better for the average and 250% better for the 1% low. So that's a good step up. It's about a third faster, a little bit more than that, but a lot less stutters. When I was testing the FX chip, there was some stutters, obviously, but this game just blasts through this on this CPU. Honestly, it's not that useful of a benchmark going forward, but we'll keep it here just as a point of reference. This game has a 200 FPS cap anyway, so we'll see what CPU can hit that. In Forza Horizon 4, I got an average of 110 and a 1% low of 84. That's 18% better than the FX chip. So not nothing, but not a huge gap. If we go to Need for Speed Heat, this one was again slightly disappointing, only 14% better, with a 65% average. Yes, the average now is above 60, but I would still argue that's not very smooth for this game. This game still has quite a bit of stutters and shader compilation and whatever it may be. But it smoothed out a couple of the rough edges. If we go to Rise of the Tomb Raider, I got an average of 110 FPS, so that's 36% better, so a little bit better result. And a 1% low of 50, and that's 14% better than the FX chip. This game runs just fine, but actually, this game had a couple issues in bigger open areas like the geothermal valley, but in most caves and closed off spaces, it wasn't too bad. I think as if you play this game for a while, it'll smooth itself out, but honestly, not a huge improvement again. Jedi Fallen Order, I got an average of 78 FPS and a 1% low of 30. That's 15% better for the average. So it is better, but again, this game has quite a bit of stutters. So it wasn't the smoothest 78 FPS, but it was for sure playable, and it works perfectly for this age of game. If we go over to Fortnite, this one was pretty good. Now, we can't it's like comparing apples to oranges. It was a different season when I tested the FX chip, but still, I'm still compared them, even though realistically it's probably not a good comparison. I got an average of 97 FPS with a 1% low of 50, so that's about 8% better on the averages, but completely different season for the FX chip, so it's not a fair comparison, but I would argue it's still quite a bit better on this chip. Not in terms of pure number, but just like the FX chip, it played it just fine, and I would have no complaints with a decent GPU with this game. Now, it's not quite high refresh rate territory, but I was still able to feel like I wasn't being held back too much. In Red Dead Redemption 2, I got an average of 70 FPS with a 1% low of 30. That's a 12% better average and a 20% better 1% low. 30 FPS is kind of like my minimum I want my 1% lows to be, because if it's lower, you know you're getting some big stutters. But overall, this one felt pretty good, and this CPU fits right in for this. If we go over to one of our most demanding games, we got Hogwarts Legacy. This got an average of 56 FPS with a 1% low of 30. So only 6% better for the average, but 88% better for the 1% low, which is super helpful. Got rid of a lot of the stutters. But every time you go into town, you go around a lot of NPCs, it's still quite a low FPS experience. This is not a locked 60, but it's playable. It's okay. It didn't feel overly smooth, but it works considering how new this game is and how old the CPU is. The CPU is running a 10-year newer game than it was ever intended. So, I guess give it some slack, right? If we go over to our just last two newer multiplayer games, we go over to Marvel Rivals. I got an average of 79 FPS and a 1% low of 44. Not much better, only 5% better than the FX chip in the average, and 26% better in the 1% low. Again, there's not really a whole lot in this CPU compared to the FX chip. I am curious to see, and I'm sure everyone can go look at old YouTube videos, what it was more like back in the day. I'm sure it was a lot stronger considering the CPU was more expensive than the FX chip. But overall, for most of these games, with some mix of new and old, it's not a whole lot better. But if we make our way over to Battlefield 6, I got an average of 61 and a 1% low of 38. That's 40% better for the average and 89% better for the 1%. You know what? Actually, for this game, it makes all the difference. I think with the FX chip, it was kind of unplayable. And with this chip, it's actually quite usable. You know, it's not the highest frame rate experience. I would want a little bit more. But for how new this game is, it's nice to see that this CPU can punch way above what its age indicates. If I was a teenager or I was really budget conscious, I think this would be totally fine. It's probably just not worth seeking out, specifically this CPU. There's a lot better things for probably about the same price. On average, the i7-3770 is 18% better than the FX8350 in terms of frame rate. And in terms of 1% lows, it's 57% better. So, it kind of irons out a lot of the stutters the FX had and raises the bar slightly. I wouldn't say this is an upgrade. If you have an FX, or if you had an FX, going to the CPU isn't worth the upgrade. You would want something significantly faster to become worth it. But if you had this CPU, or you were using it as a side computer or something, it's still usable. It's nothing special. There's other CPUs that are probably better for your money, but, you know, this one works, as well as DDR3 still super cheap. This isn't really a buying recommendation, more just a look back at the i7-3770. And I will say overall, it's actually kind of disappointing. The FX chip was surprising. This one was disappointing. The only reason why I say that is because I was led to believe back then how much better the Intel chips were, and this really isn't much better than the FX chip in most situations. It's fine, it gets by, but it's not worth really considering. Still fun to look back at a 14-year-old CPU though. Let me know, what's your guys' experience with the i7-3770 or just that generation of Intel processors? Was it a good experience, or was it kind of underwhelming. I think at the time it was probably a pretty great situation, especially with the i3s and i5s probably being decent value. But if we look at it with a modern lens, the FX chip and the i7 aren't too far apart. They're kind of similar classes of performance. Just, a lot easier to run for the i7. And of course, if you get something that can overclock, it could probably widen the gap. Either way, thanks for watching, and have a good rest of your day.